It's no secret that Russia is currently waging a war against Ukraine in an attempt to expand its territory along its western borders with Europe. But what if this war of territorial expansion, rather than giving Russia more defensible space, actually instead ends up creating a domino effect that ultimately causes Russia to lose most of its eastern empire? Believe it or not, it's not only possible, but it may already be happening. And it's because China is now using Russia's own playbook against them. Currently, Russia has managed to occupy Ukrainian territory of around 33,000 square miles, approximately the size of the US state of South Carolina. But if Russia isn't able to successfully end its war soon, they may be putting at risk the entire Siberian territory, which is more than 150 times the size of what they currently occupy in Ukraine, equal to nearly 1.5 times the area of the entire United States, including Alaska and Hawaii. That might seem far-fetched, until you take a look at what recently happened here. This is the Great Ussuri Island, a place that might seem unimportant to most of us, but certainly not to Russia or China. For a long time, it has been fiercely contested by both nations, and last year, while Russia was busy and distracted at war with Ukraine, China quietly claimed this small slice of Siberia back into their own sovereign territory. That might at first seem insignificant, because the initial territorial claim was small, just 135 square miles, or around 215 square kilometers. But while the territory may have been small, the geopolitical gesture most certainly was not. Because in many ways, this small slice of land could be the single most strategic and dangerous piece of territory in all of vast Siberia. And if a war were ever to start in the region, it would be extremely likely to start here. It all centers around Khabarovsk, one of the largest cities in Siberia and the largest population center by far in the surrounding area, one of the very few places in Siberia where a significant number of Russians actually live, currently having a population of 630,000, or nearly 10% of the population of the entire Russian Far East. And this massive Siberian city sits right off the eastern tip of Great Ussuri Island. This has always made Russia nervous. Nearly 100 years ago, in 1929, Russia invaded the island and stole it from China for a very specific purpose, to create a buffer zone that would bring Khabarovsk out of the range of any future hostile artillery fire. Ever since that invasion, China has always wanted the island back, holding that Russia's claims to it are illegal and invalid. China and Russia managed to negotiate a partial solution in 2008, where the nations would split the island in half. But apparently, most Chinese still weren't satisfied with that solution. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, China saw their opportunity. The following August, when the Russian military was at a very weak point, China released a new national map, conveniently including the entire Great Ussuri Island as part of their own territory, completely disregarding the Russian half. For the first time in nearly 100 years, the largest city in eastern Siberia was now potentially in artillery range of foreign territory once again. But the nightmare for Russia didn't stop there, because potential artillery fire is actually just one small piece of a much larger set of dominoes. Many people know that the Chinese Empire used to be far more vast than it is today, with a huge swath of land now known as Outer Manchuria and what is now modern-day Russian Siberia. This territory was lost to Russia during the mid-1800s, under what China has long considered unfair treaties. And since that time, there have been many speculations that China might one day try to take this territory back. And that's where things get really interesting. You see, the Great Ussuri Island, which China claimed back last year, also happens to control access to the Amur River, a large, navigable river that roughly cuts the famous Outer Manchurian territory in half, and remains one of the few feasible routes for mass transportation in a region with few roads. And if China managed to navigate up this river and place troops on the eastern side of it, they could quickly reclaim and fortify half of Outer Manchuria in a single stroke, fulfilling a long-standing goal of Chinese dynasties going back over 150 years, and paving the way for further territorial gains, potentially going as far as the Ural Mountains. But could it actually happen? And will China actually use Russia's invasion of Ukraine as an opportunity for their own land grabs of Russian territory? Thinking about this personally, I'm always grateful that I'm not a politician who has to constantly worry about defending my territory, or if someone will try to take over my land and my people the second that I turn my back and take a break. But one thing that I do worry about a lot is losing my wallet, full of my cash, my personal information, and my credit cards, which has happened to me more times than I would like to admit. Thankfully, I now never have to worry about that again, and neither do you. That brings me briefly to Exter, the sponsor that made the complex research, animation, and editing for this episode possible. Exter makes the #1 rated smart wallet in the world, and I've been a fan for a long time. Opening up my Exter wallet is an experience. There's a perfect space for everything I need, which I'd expect from my wallet, and an incredibly satisfying trigger mechanism to push out my credit cards and make them super easy to grab. The wallet also has an RFID blocker, and a perfect spot for their nifty Finder card that lets me track my wallet via GPS, and also lets me do this. Hey Siri, find my wallet. Nice. So I don't have to waste hours of my life looking for my wallet all the time anymore either. We take our wallet with us everywhere we go, so why shouldn't it be the most functional and satisfying thing we carry? Right now, Exter is having their Father's Day sale, offering 40% off their products. But you can get an even better deal than that by using my code, Icarus, to take an extra 5% off at checkout. So get yours today while the sale is still on by following the link in the description of this video and using my code. He will win who, prepared himself, waits to take the enemy unprepared. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. As you can see from this quote, Chinese war philosophy has always centered to a large degree on taking the enemy by surprise. And for that reason, any discussion of a potential Chinese attack will always contain a healthy degree of speculation, because truly we won't know until such a thing actually happens. At the same time, it's also possible to simply assume that something won't happen or can't happen simply because it sounds drastic. In World War II, much of Europe failed to believe that Germany would actually invade other nations that they specifically said they planned to invade. And even in the case of Russia itself, when Russia began to prepare to invade Ukraine, much of the world didn't believe it could happen until it had actually happened. There's an interesting phenomenon in our world where, despite the fact that we see wars and human evil every day, many of us behave as if future major wars are impossible, even as we see them unfolding before our very eyes. Many of us, for example, do something very strange without even realizing it. We take our maps and the borders that are on them for a given, assuming they will never change, or at least certainly not in our lifetimes. But this attitude is a uniquely modern privilege, especially prevalent among those born after the end of the Cold War, stemming from a time of relative geopolitical stability, at least from a territorial integrity standpoint. And the truth is, for almost all of human history, the opposite has been true, and maps have never really been this stable. In centuries past, nations weakened by war have consistently been taken advantage of by the nations that surrounded them while they were at their lowest point. And such situations are what have often led to the collapse of kingdoms and of empires. And to those it happened to, it always seemed a ridiculous idea, until it happened. The question then is this currently happening to Russia? And the answer is a definite maybe. Because the truth is, Russia's current situation has opened up a world of possibilities that China has been waiting for a very long time. Many people look at Russia and China and assume that they are natural allies. But the reality is that this could not be further from the truth. As the saying goes, nations don't have allies, they have interests. In the case of China and Russia right now, they are convenient partners by necessity. But for most of their respective histories, the two nations have been fiercely opposed to each other, and always proving themselves willing to take advantage of their neighbor's misfortune, with only brief historical periods of intermission to this trend. Skipping about a 1,000-year period of on and off strife that led to the loss of China's Outer Manchuria to Russia, even as recently as the Cold War, Russia and China found themselves in frequent close calls, and conflicts that almost escalated into all-out nuclear war. This includes a specific situation where China amassed a huge army of more than 1,300,000 soldiers across the border from Outer Manchuria and engaged Russia in armed skirmishes over the islands and the rivers along the border, which should sound familiar because, as we just discussed, islands in these rivers are still the flashpoint between Russia and China today. Often, the only thing that kept the two nations from completely destroying each other during the Cold War period was what was perceived as a common enemy. The United States, which was ideologically opposed to the communism present in both nations, and which each nation figured was likely to finish them off if they ever actually went to war against each other. But a war with China was something that the Soviet Union was still always very seriously worried about, and the underlying geographical reasons for that concern never actually disappeared. The situation is actually very simple. China is one of the most heavily industrialized nations on Earth, with an absolutely massive human population and a seemingly unquenchable desire for land and raw resources to feed its insanely large manufacturing industry. But China is also a relatively resource-poor nation. Notably, it does not have enough domestic energy reserves for its own needs, and so it must import huge quantities of coal, natural gas, and oil to keep running. Russia, for its part, is the opposite. It is the largest nation on Earth in terms of sheer landmass and raw resource reserves, especially the oil and natural gas that China craves, sitting very temptingly directly north of China's major population centers. But Russia has a very small population, considering the size of its territory, roughly just a tenth of the population of China. And so Russia has never had a population large enough, or national coffers rich enough, to truly leverage this landmass or these resources to their full potential. The nation is also split into two major parts: the population centers to the west of the Ural Mountains in Eastern Europe, and the vast, mostly unpopulated territories to the east of the Ural Mountains on the Asian side in Siberia, where most of the resources are. This fact means most of Russia's rich reserves sit in Asia, often further from the majority Russian population than the entire width of the United States or Europe. Basically, in another world, where no Russians really want to live or work, unless they're desperate. Currently, there are only roughly 8 million Russians in the entire Far East, but there are nearly 110 million Chinese citizens right across the border from it. And Russia's greatest fear has long been, and still is, that one day this population will cross over and simply take this sparsely populated territory from them. Today, as the war in Ukraine has progressed, with the Russian army being largely decimated and completely preoccupied, but unable or unwilling to back down, it has put Russia in a very vulnerable position if China desires to do to Russia exactly what Russia did to them in 1858. Stack troops along the border and demand Russia cede the Outer Manchurian territory to them if they want to avoid a war. To prepare for such a situation, Beijing could use Russia's own strategy against them, moving their people into the region, then handing out passports to sympathizers in contested areas, and then moving in militarily under the guise of protecting Chinese citizens. After all, the Kremlin has tried this exact same thing in Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and most recently, in Ukraine. So they obviously think it's a legitimate strategy. And because of Russia's shaky history on this, in this case, if China tried such a thing, Russia would not have an international argument to make in their own defense, without undermining nearly every other international position they currently hold. One of the biggest ironies of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that the talking points they use to justify it are actually more valid for China to use against Russia than they are for Russia to use against Eastern Europe. China, for example, has a far older claim to Outer Manchuria than Russia has to the territories they currently occupy in Ukraine, something many Chinese citizens were quick to point out after Tucker Carlson's famous interview with Vladimir Putin. After Putin used historical arguments to undermine the legal agreements he had violated when he invaded Ukraine, many in China decided to use his same arguments against him, demanding that Russia surrender the port of Vladivostok back to China, which is Russia's main naval port on the Pacific Ocean and a major part of their nuclear deterrence. The reason cited was that China's history over the region should supersede any supposed modern legal agreements. That's part of the problem with starting to talk like you're an old empire. Do it for long enough, and people begin to treat you like it's true, just not in the way you were hoping for, resurrecting their grievances against long-dead czars and pointing them at you instead. Because it's inconsistent to try to claim the benefits of a dead empire if you're not also willing to bear its shame. All this said, a military action by China in the near future still seems unlikely, although with their recent territorial claims, they have definitely begun to set the table in a way that will allow for one at a later date if they so choose. But what is even more likely is a cultural takeover by China. Or a cultural takeover could be used as a first step to prepare for an invasion if China adopted Russia's own tactics. Russia itself is intimately familiar with this strategy, having adopted it as its own personal favorite. And as such, this is something that Russia has been trying to avoid from China for decades. For a very long time, Russian state TV has had significant anti-China immigration tones, similar to the immigration debates you will often hear about between the United States and Mexico. Except that Russia's tone has often been much harsher against China than Americans are against immigrants from their south. A big concern in Russia has been that Chinese workers might cross the border and eventually dominate Siberian culture. And because of this, China's desires to invest in Siberia have been largely stifled due to political opposition for decades. But because of the wall they've backed themselves up against in Ukraine, Russia has now been forced to make major concessions in this area to buy themselves more time. Following the invasion, which has taken far longer than Russia ever hoped, China is now Russia's only real hope of keeping their economy afloat. And China definitely knows this. They've been playing hardball here, forcing Russia to make concessions to allow further inroads for Chinese businesses, which are often owned by the Chinese state and used as a sort of front for Chinese national control over Siberian land. Essentially, in lieu of tempting China to capture Siberia militarily, Russia is being forced to sell or lease Siberia to China instead. A prime and recent example is once again the Great Ussuri Island, which we talked about at the beginning of this video. When China claimed this territory as their own, Russia obviously had to do something, and their response betrayed their weakness. Initially, Russia made public statements that everything was fine, and that the issue had been settled for more than 15 years, and that there were no current problems. But China, for its part, did not say this. They published their map claiming Russian territory as their own, in violation of the previous agreements that Russia said were still fine. And when Russia responded, China doubled down and stood by their claim. So despite publicly claiming there were no issues, Russia quietly returned to the negotiation table with China, and the end result was a historic agreement just a few days before this video was posted, allowing for the joint development of the territory that had been claimed by China. By joint development, they probably meant, we're gonna cave in and let China develop this. This was essentially a face-saving maneuver that allowed the Kremlin to pose the situation as a positive and give the territory to China without actually saying they were giving it to them. You can almost hear Putin trying to explain this one away. It's not really theirs, we're just jointly developing it, all with Chinese investment, Chinese workers, and Chinese equipment to build a staging post for the Chinese military on the Russian border. Critics inside Russia itself saw right through the scheme, seeing this as a concession to officially give China the territory at a future date, without immediately exposing obvious fractures in the weakened international relationship. And as such, the Chinese inroads that Russia has long been fighting are now beginning to develop in full force, with the blessing of the Russian government that only recently vehemently opposed them. And China has successfully claimed and held a strategic foothold that they could use as a launching ground to recapture Outer Manchuria for the first time since 1929. And with all of their national resources focused on Ukraine, there's nothing Russia can do about it. So yes, China is already replacing Russia in Siberia. But it's not such a bad deal for Russia. Rumor is, they let China have the Siberian land long enough. China might in return give some of that Russian brass, lead, and copper back to them, from a range of about 200 yards. Of course, when I imply that Russia might someday lose portions of their territory, I'm often met with extreme skepticism. But the truth is, there are currently vast swaths of the world that were once part of Russian territory in very recent history, that now are not. Many nations exist today because they rebelled from and left Russia, including the nations that many of my regular viewers come from. Most of the former Soviet bloc of Europe serves as a prime example, as do Georgia and Azerbaijan. And the same sentiments that led these territories to separate still exist, and have long existed within the remaining nations in Russian Siberia. The main difference is that these nations simply have lower populations, and therefore never had an ability to secede from Moscow directly. But perhaps, if China wanted to leverage those sentiments for their own purposes, they could. To learn more about that topic, check out my entire 30-minute episode on the subject, Why Siberians Want to Secede from Russia. I'll see you on the next video.